Some people claim that this is the most haunted neighborhood in the nation. I don't know how you prove or disprove that. Virtually every building has some sort of ghost story associated with it due to the age of New Orleans. We were established in 1718, and all the various people that died in the buildings, murders that took place in the buildings, yellow fever epidemics which killed people off, these ghost stories started to evolve around about the time of the WPA started to document them in the 1930s. I'm Robby, and I'm an architect here in New Orleans. Today we're going to be walking through the historic French Quarter, and we're going to be visiting some of the haunted houses here in the quarter. As the quarter began to decline, there was legislation introduced into the city council to demolish our cabildo, our presbytery, the Pontalba buildings on Jackson Square, the heart of the French Quarter there. It was architects and writers and lawyers and all that got together to help save the quarter. Ghost stories were one of these factors that helped save the quarter by bringing people interested into the occult. The story, which evolved around the old Ursuline convent, concerns vampires here in the city of New Orleans. The story was that the Ursuline nuns brought to the city of New Orleans the casket girls, young women from France. They contained a little small box which had their trousseau to be able to marry the French Canadians that had settled New Orleans. Well, the story then became that in the caskets were actually vampires and not their trousseau, and that's how vampires came to New Orleans, and they were housed in the building here by the Catholic Church. The shutters on the third floor there is allegedly keeping all the vampires locked up in the third floor. As far as I know, we didn't have any vampires in New Orleans until Anne Rice wrote Interview with the Vampire, and now vampires are everywhere you go. We've got vampire restaurants, vampire houses, they sell vampire blood in stores here, and we've got all these vampire stories in New Orleans. Now, architecturally, the building is the oldest building in the city of New Orleans and the oldest building in the entire Mississippi Valley. It's the only French colonial building we have in the entire country. It's designed by Ignatius Brutin, a French military engineer, and it was designed in 1745 and completed, we're not quite sure, about 1751. The building is French colonial. What's French here? The big steep roof. The big steep roof is to get snow and ice off the building in France. It rarely snows in New Orleans, but LSU has done studies and found that those steep attics, a low pressure forms like a hurricane and gets the natural ventilation through the building, which wasn't intentional, but that's what occurs there. There's French casement doors in the windows, which makes it very French. The banding around the windows is very French. Some of the oldest wrought iron in the city of New Orleans is on the staircase and used on the building there today. It one time served as Louisiana state capitol during the administration of Governor Romaine. It's been a college, it's been a public school. It was the center for the Sicilian community here in New Orleans. In fact, I was baptized in the chapel in the building there. We're allegedly at one of the more haunted houses in the French Quarter today, the Laurie house. In the 1830s, neighbors always heard screams coming out of the house from the enslaved people there. They also witnessed a very young girl jumping off the roof of the house to flee the owner, Madame Laurie's, chasing her with a whip. Then in 1834, a fire broke out in the house. Well, the judge that lived next door got a group of New Orleans together and they broke into the house and they found the enslaved people there were chained. They were covered with sores. The cook in the house allegedly started the fire. She says, "I would rather die than continue living like this." Now, legend says today you can still hear screams coming from the house. You can see flashing lights in the windows. You can smell the perfume of the Madame Laurie going through the house in there. The problem is, this is not the Laurie house. What the fire had not destroyed, the citizens destroyed, and that house was completely wiped out. It was an exposed red brick house, only 2 stories in height. After the Louisiana Purchase, the Empire style became popular in New Orleans. This is perhaps the best example of that style here in the city. What is Empire about it? Unfortunately, on the exterior, a lot of the details have been lost. However, the front door is exceptionally fine there with all these Empire details. When I did the restoration of that door, it was so encrusted with paint and the material is a composite there, I had to get a conservator to use dental equipment to pick the paint off the door there so all these wonderful details could pop on it. On the second floor of the house, you can see some of the detailing up in there that survives from the Empire style. We see the American 5-point star being used, as well as the American eagle, which can be clearly seen on the front door of the house here. But all the doors in this house have spectacular detailing in it. At one time, this house was owned by Nicolas Cage, the actor. He was very much into the occult, the story of the incident which took place in this house. I don't think he realized that that's not the actual house standing today when he acquired it, but he no longer owns it. We're standing in front of Moro Castle right now. It's named for the fortifications in Havana, Cuba. The legend with this particular building is that during the Spanish colonial period, the Spanish soldiers were quartered here. Many of them left to go help the Americans in the American Revolution, and some of them were left back here in New Orleans with the payroll for the military. Those soldiers stationed here stole the Spanish gold in the building. When the commanding officer returned from Florida, he found that the payroll was missing. He took the men that stole the money, hung them on meat hooks, then staked their feet into the wall, then put live rats on their abdomen, then walled them on over in this building, except for their faces showing through the wall. They could see the men in horror as the rats ate their bodies from the inside the wall there. Now, legend says that those Spanish soldiers' faces now appear in this wall. That's more of what I call moonlight manure. This building was never a barracks, it was never a castle, it was built as a residence. I don't think it's haunted. There's no way that this was the Spanish barracks here because it's not built until well into the American time frame. The 1830s is when the bulk of the buildings in the French Quarter were built, and that's the time frame of this particular building here. The building was actually begun in 1833 by a man from England. He began construction on the building, and the financial panic of 1837 nationwide caused the project to be shut down. A subsequent developer acquired the property and finished the building shortly thereafter. He imported all the granite you see on this building from Quincy, Massachusetts. There's no stone in the entire state of Louisiana from which to build. All of our stone, the marble, the granite, anything like that was imported on ships into the city of New Orleans. The building has a wonderful balcony surrounding it there with wrought iron on it there, and the porte-cochere gate also has some nice wrought iron details on it there. Wrought iron would be the earliest metals used in New Orleans, later being replaced by cast iron, which would be imported from the Northeast. The lanterns you see on the building are recent additions to the French Quarter. Some of them are electric, some of them are gas. These happen to be electric here. In the 19th century, many buildings did not have light fixtures like this on the exterior. The lighting was generally confined to the interior of the structures. We're now in front of St. Louis Cathedral. This is the third church to stand on this particular site, and it's haunted by Pierre Dagobert. He was a Catholic priest, and when Spain took over New Orleans were not very happy about that. They were worried about the Spanish Inquisition coming to New Orleans and all. So they led a revolt against the Spanish government. The leaders of the revolt were executed by the Spanish government, and the bodies weren't returned to the families. He worked with all of the women there, obtained the bodies, took them to the cathedral, had proper burial there, and then took them off to the cemetery. Now today, supposedly you can hear Pierre Dagobert singing the Kyrie as he walks through the church, along the alleys on the side, bringing the bodies to proper burials at St. Louis Cemetery. Architecturally, the cathedral is quite interesting. It's done in the Neo-Greek style. The architect for the church, Dupuy, was trained in architecture in France. France did not follow the Greek Revival style that we use in the United States or in Great Britain. You can see on the church the classical elements. The three spires are set by the earlier church during the Spanish colonial period, which was built on the site there. The central spire on the church was originally iron and wood, and it was open air. When it was first built, many people panned it. They hated the design. One historian wrote, it was an upstart of bad taste. Today, it's the logo for the city of New Orleans. We closely identify with that cathedral on Jackson Square as the symbol of the city of New Orleans. Borgard Kai's name comes from General P.G.T. Borgard, who lived in here a short period of time. He was a Confederate general that opened fire on Fort Sumter starting the Civil War. Francis Parkinson Kais was a writer of Southern literature who lived here, and so between Borgard and Kais, that's where the house takes its name from. There are 4 ghost stories associated with this particular house. One is that General Borgard fought against General Grant in the Battle of Shiloh. Borgard lost horribly there, and supposedly in the house, the bloodied soldiers come out of the walls and try to reenact the Battle of Shiloh, but they never quite get it done, and so their ghosts keep appearing and trying to win this battle, which they never do. The second story is also associated with the Civil War. There was a large soiree planned in the house in the ballroom. When the Civil War breaks out, the men had to leave to go fight in the war, and so the soiree never took place. So in the ballroom, supposedly the ghosts of the men and women in these antebellum costumes appear coming out of the walls, and they have their dance in the house, and then at midnight, the ghosts disappear again. The third story involves a mafia incident. The family were Sicilian wine merchants, and they were blackmailed for extortion money. Under the pretense of paying them the money, they invited them to dinner on the back porch. The family, instead of serving dessert, stood up and shot the mafia members. Some of them died on the porch, some of them died in the alley there. Now, supposedly now you get this very strong smell of garlic, then these guns appear in midair, shooting the mafia members there, and then it all disappears again. The final story takes place because the man who built the house, grandson was Paul Morphy, a world chess champion, can be seen playing chess on the various porches of the house or even in the house. Now, architecturally, it was originally planned in a very Creole manner. A rez-de-chaussée, which is the ground floor, a premier étage, which is the principal floor of the house, and had a porch on the front and back. Then an architect who's originally living in Baltimore, his families are refugees from the Santo Domingo slave revolt. He eventually makes his way to New Orleans, and he tries to make the house as American as possible. The ground floor there you can see on the house is stuccoed, but it's scored, and we've recently had it painted in imitation of granite, which was a common thing to do. We're in the process of restoring the building. We're doing it all with very thorough research, paint analysis of the stucco and so forth. And we're putting back materials that we used historically because the new modern materials, elastomeric coating and high Portland concentrate stucco, causes damage to the buildings. And we find that going back to the original construction techniques, the buildings can be saved for the ghost to haunt in the future years and so forth in the building there.